we've got a good chunk of time, maybe 15-20 minutes for conversation, and I would love to be challenged, educated, learn something that maybe you here that you have a question about. Yes.
I'm sorry. Well, first I want to thank you for your message that you shared with us. I wanted to ask you the correct definition that you said was a pro-feminist man. Because I didn't get all of that, and I wanted to make sure that I quoted you correctly. So what was it that you were saying?
Okay. I'm glad that you asked that because it gives me a chance to read something, a definition that's right in the book. Okay. So why the term pro-feminist rather than feminist man or male feminist? And I'm going to be quoting from my friend and colleague, the sociologist and writer Michael Kimmel. Stripped to its essential, he says, feminism involves the empirical observation that women and men are not equal in either the public or the private sphere, and also the moral stance that such inequality is wrong and ought to be changed. Men may agree with this empirical assessment of women's subordinate status and the moral imperative to work toward equality. In that sense, men believe in feminism, but to be a feminist requires another ingredient, the felt experience of oppression, and that men cannot feel because men are not oppressed, but privileged by sexism. So that's kind of the position that I take, and I know that it's not one, there are lots of people who, male feminists, but that's the position that I and a lot of my colleagues take. Is that?
So that you side and you agree and you join in the fight and believe in the cause, basically.
Yeah. Yes.
Earlier you mentioned Ray Rice and how he was kicked off the team and all that for the domestic violence. There was like a similar case with Hope Solo where she's a female soccer player and she was charged with domestic violence around the same time that Ray Rice was charged with domestic violence. And she didn't have any of the same repercussions that Ray Rice had. She still has her contract with Nike. She's still playing on the soccer team. I was just curious as to like your opinion on that. Like, would you riot for Hope Solo to be persecuted to the full extent of the law just as Ray Rice is? Because it is equality.
Right. The specifics of what happened, I think, were quite different.
Yeah, definitely.
Like,
Ray Rice was a very public situation where he was caught on camera, whereas it was a situation where she was at home and something happened, but either way they're both charged with domestic violence.
Right. So this is one of those false equivalencies, in my mind. I mean, and certainly being challenged, reprimanded, and held accountable, did the behavior rise to the level of losing your job? That's the question that's been asked, and apparently how it's been seen, it's like it's not on the same level.
Right.
And I don't think that it comes down to that it being a gendered thing. I think that it's really a question of like, what are the expectations that we have of each other? I don't think anybody is saying that was cool what she did.
Right.
And I think that she has to live with that that's become public, something that was, internal to her own home, in her own home. But nobody should get a pass from acting like that. Yes.
You talk about the negative connotation with the word feminist, and I think it's a very timely argument. Last week, Beyonce came under fire for calling herself a feminist because of her overt sexuality, and I just want to kind of gather your perspective on that.
Well, this is the thing. I mean, the stereotype, of what a woman who's a feminist is kind of ridiculous. That you can't, that you have to look a certain way. If a woman believes in equality and she has a platform and her name is Beyonce and she, it's like, come on down, the water's fine. One can question among any of us, gee, I wouldn't go out dressed like that, or I wouldn't want X friend or whomever to go out dressed like that. But that's like, we live in a country where people can dress and put themselves out there. If their beliefs are being challenged, because of the way that you look, and then you're not actually listening to what's being said, I think that this is another one of those examples of the powers that be wanting to undermine her having a platform. Because, whoa, if Beyonce reached us in a way that Gloria Steinem couldn't, what's going to happen? Then women are really going to get more powerful, and women are going to demand more power. Oh yeah, you were next.
This is an experience I see in my household. I'm coming from a very traditional family.
Speak up a little bit.
I'm coming from a very traditional family, very paternalistic in how the power structure is in my family. And really between that and conservatism in this country, what do you think is the bigger really hurdle for the feminism movement?
Between individual families and the overall conservative movement?
Not so much overall families, but the whole kind of paternalistic power structure that's really been in this country since the birth of the nuclear family and the whole concept in the 60s.
I think that what we need is to have more young men rejecting that model. That, when I was growing up, there was this TV show called Father Knows Best. And it was just, he was a kind and gentle, patriarchal head of the family. So the notion that we're in this tremendous period of change where there are lots of examples of more egalitarian households, and to be able to go back and to maybe this isn't the conversation to have over Thanksgiving dinner, but maybe it is to say, I'm not sure, Dad or Uncle Fred, that the way that you guys did things is the way that I'm going to do things, or I have some questions about that. I mean, how come, you got to go, do all these things and Mom and Aunt Betty didn't? I think that that's not fair. So there are some older men who have started to get it, and I think, as a culture, we are in transition around these issues. And what we see is, politically, that people who identify as conservatives are the ones who are trying to stop the tide of change. And they are the ones who are trying to undermine women's progress. They certainly have been in the gay rights front, and just specific to gay marriage, they've been the ones who've been flipping out about, what for the majority and all the polling of people of your generation is like, what's the good look? People love each other and they create a life together. So we're seeing social progress in some areas like gay marriage, and then we're seeing social regression in some areas like women's reproductive rights and the question of men as head of household.
My question is, how does men correlate with the American dream?
With
Not the American dream is like, a husband and wife, two children, like 3 kids. Is it like going outside of the American dream, small box, like doing things a different way where it don't have to be so traditional as if the man is the provider of the woman and also. Is it like challenging the American dream in a sense?
Well, could everybody hear that? About the question was about, how does this pro-feminist men's work and men changing, how does that fit in with the American dream of the heterosexual couple with the 2 kids and the white picket fence? That dream is not operating anymore to any large numbers. The economics of our time is, both people, regardless of whether it's 2 men, 2 women, a man, a woman, both people need to be in the workforce, both people need to be figuring out how to make things work. So that old message, which there certainly are pockets of around the country and pockets of people who still believe in it, but it's just not what's operating anymore. And I think if nostalgia and longing for the good old days, when you really go back and look at the good old days, they weren't necessarily so good. I mean, they were very real, just like these present days are. So, we could look back fondly through some gauzy lens on the slow-mo camera, but what we would find is a woman who, should have been getting her PhD and teaching is not able to work because her husband said, basically, you're not working, I can provide for us. And not being willing to say, well, actually, I'm really insecure and fearful that because you're so smart, you're going to end up, getting a really good job, and you might make more money than me, and I'm going to be really freaked out. So even though it's going to improve our family's economic situation, and you're going to be modeling for our children with a strong, independent woman, let's get our priorities straight. My insecurity has to come first. So this is really, thank you for that question, and I'll see you later for your check. But this is really the transition that we're in. There still is that pull. There still are those messages, but we can't go back. That's really what this is about. For the guys in the room, if you're feeling a little fearful about like, I thought things were going to proceed in this way that the society had told me from long ago that it was going to be, and now I don't know, the landscape is kind of rocky and I might stumble. Just take a breath, maybe look to another guy who you can talk to about this. And I really encourage all the guys here, if there isn't a men's project or men's group on campus, maybe just to have discussion, not necessarily be an activist group initially, but just to talk about these issues and to wrestle with them, to read some of the stuff, and to really ask yourselves, what does all this mean to me? When, to the extent that this movement has been much more public and not one of the most important social justice movements you've never heard of, it is a social justice movement that we've all heard of. But the men's side of it, I really encourage you, if you're feeling a little fearful, to find some other men to talk about this with and ask, the professors that are teaching courses, talk to them. And if you're not signed up for one of these courses, maybe you should look at the catalog for the spring or the fall next year.
Okay, so thank you first of all, Rob. That was good to hear about things that I feel many of us, certainly myself included, I know a lot about women's movements around the world, but I had not realized that there were quite a few men's groups globally that were out there trying to talk about a message for gender justice. But I'm curious, a lot of women's groups in the global south particularly come under attack for their agendas because they're seen as being somehow importing a Western ideology. And I'm wondering if any of the men's groups that you were mentioning and that you're aware of, if they've ever had those kinds of critiques or attacks made upon them in any of these countries, the Kurdish group or in India or whatever. So that was one question, and I'm going to sneak in just another comment, where you didn't talk about the rise of the religious right, both in this country and around the world, because I think that there are a lot of women who also feel that they want, a different, they don't believe necessarily in this message. I mean, and we talked about, I'm thinking of Tennessee recently, where they have these clinics, which are not abortion clinics, but rather clinics that are set up to discourage women from, owning their own needs and having their own control over their bodies. And they're run by women. So we've always had that, but it seems like there's a renaissance of that also, that feeling. So I'm wondering if you can say something about those two things.
there is certainly backlash against men who do this work. I've had emails that have said, why do you call your magazine Voice Male? You should call your magazine Voice Female. And there's a derisive term used to describe some of us in this work, manginas. So there certainly is a lot of pushback, and it's that happens in all these cultures. So even though there may be more in the U.S., some of these organizations may have been around for 30 or 40 years, we're still not so large that we feel protected. In many countries, there's actually it's much more of a courageous stance. I mean, those Kurdish men, walking publicly dressed like that, are putting themselves out there. So there's a tremendous awareness, that those of us who are fomenting this kind of change that we have to be mindful of. Where we can find, this kind of strange bedfellows is around fatherhood. So those campaigns, you can't find anyone who isn't supporting, positive involvement in caregiving and supporting maternal health. So you have to kind of navigate through, and continue to look for allies. Part of the reason we were discussing that this symposium is happening in Delhi as opposed to somewhere else was because of the notoriety that happened after a medical student in December of 2012 was raped by a number of men on this bus driving around to Delhi and then subsequently died, and a number of men who got involved in the outcry, the protest afterwards, kind of raised the consciousness there. Your second point.
The religious right and women's role in it. That's a tough one.
Yeah. Well, there's a correlation between the religious right and there's another aspect of men's work that's a different movement that's called the men's rights movement. And these are the men who are often affiliated with religious right, who are the antithesis of what I'm talking about, who want everything to go back to picket fence land and everything go back to patriarchy, men being in control. And these are the men who are not talking to each other in a way of curiosity and openness to find out what's going on, but are talking to each other about how they've been getting screwed over, and women run the world, and feminism is wrecking my life, and all of these things. I mean, and they have these ideas that are just so out of step with reality. Women are in charge of everything. It's a common complaint now. We used to be in charge, now women are. And then you say, okay, well, let's go look at the makeup of the United States Congress. Let's go look at the makeup of the United States Supreme Court. Let's go look at the makeup of the Fortune 500 companies. Let's go look at the leadership in the military. It's like, show me the data. But I always try to keep, even though they've said some vicious things, and some of them are pretty angry and have done some stalking behaviors around ex-wives who they're in custody battles with. Even as bad as some of the behavior is, I try to keep my own sense of compassion with these guys. They're hurting, they're confused, they're sad, they don't know what's happening, they're kind of stuck. So it doesn't mean I'm not going to challenge them and to make sure that our message can get out there, but I try to hold on to their humanity, and I've had, on occasion, I've had some good dialogue with those kind of things. We have a little bit more time, so yeah.
I was wondering also, you mentioned that there is not just a masculinity now, but the men's movement is thinking in terms of masculinities. But what about men and femininities, or women and masculinities? Because that term then becomes sort of this binary, right? Relating man to masculine or women to feminine. How do we get beyond that? So that men can be feminine or women can be masculine?
I mean, I don't think that there's a how can we do it? I think we get up every day and we see what's happening and we see how people are expressing themselves. I think on the one hand, the growing acceptance of gay men and lesbians in the culture, the visibility, is an example of our expanding definitions of those words, rather than keeping them in the box of sexual orientation.
Right, but it doesn't have to be just gay men who are feminine either, right?
Right.
So it's that.
No, I wasn't suggesting that, but I was saying that that's an example of the culture in shifting. Certainly, transgender people are way more visible and way, believe me, there still is a long, long way to go, and transgender people are definitely targeted, in all societies. And there's more visibility, there's growing acceptance, there's curiosity. We are a culture in transition, so there's this national conversation. The place on the map that I put my flag was around transforming men and changing our ideas about manhood, boyhood, brotherhood, fatherhood. But the whole spectrum of what's happening is what gives me some sense of optimism, because there's definitely forward movement. Yes.
Well, first I want to thank you for your engaging presentation and welcome. Welcome to Montclair State. I just want to posit for the brave men in the room, thankfully you're here. Great, you're awesome. That for some of us, I teach undergrads and graduate students here, but the term feminism itself brings up a bunch of connectors that may or may not be accurate. When we talk about patriarchy as evil, talking about binaries, we're setting up this dichotomy that you're either a feminist or you're an evil patriarch. And I just want to, for those of you in the room where that doesn't apply, you are welcome. Part of the richness of our program here is that you can ask questions, you can inquire, you can talk to people that may or may not agree with how you think to deepen your understanding. But I don't want anyone, particularly the men in the room, to leave here feeling like either you're pro-feminist, you're a feminist supporter, or you're the enemy. Not at all. What we're trying to do is unpack language a little bit. I sort of agree with Rob that I'm not femme per se, so I rarely say I'm a feminist, but I am a feminist supporter, okay? But for those of you who are kind and respectful to all people, and you're not yet so clear about the nomenclature or the language we're using, there is room for everyone. And the bases of kindness and respect and inquiry for all, I think, provide a nice middle ground.
Thank you. Thank you. Do we have how much more time?
I think we're out of time.
What? We're at time. So that's a great ending. I often start a talk by saying if the lights went out and I only got to say 3 words, it would be believe in men.